Ancestral Narratives comprise chapters 12 to 50 of Genesis, and we're going to be thinking this morning about who are the key figures in those ancestral narratives. How would you answer that? Who are the key figures?
Well, Abraham.
Abraham.
Moses.
Moses is in Exodus.
Isaac.
Still in Genesis.
Sarah.
Isaac. Sarah.
Noah.
Isaac.
Jacob.
Noah. Jacob.
And Joseph.
Yeah.
And Joseph.
Often the way of talking about these chapters is that they are called the patriarchal narratives. This is picking up from Elizabeth's heteropatriarchy T-shirt, for those of you who are here for that discussion. Patriarchal narratives, because you can see in the right-hand side of this chart that the chapters are named after the key male, the patriarch, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph. But we have called this session the Ancestral Narratives, and we're going to be thinking about not only Abraham but Sarah, Isaac and Rebecca, Jacob and Esau, Rachel and Leah, and then Joseph. We're not going to be doing much thinking about Joseph. But so our prayer this morning was consciously shaped on the idea that there's both a patriarch and a matriarch in each of the eras of the stories that are told. You have on page 54 the family tree, or one version of the family tree of Abraham, son of Terah. And you can see that Abraham is linked up with Sarah, with Nahor, with Haran. Abraham is linked up with Sarah, with Hagar and Keturah. I'm going the wrong direction. And there are various descendants that are listed there, most of whom we know very little, if anything, about. But Ishmael and Isaac, we certainly have a focus on them. Abraham's important because he is called the father of nations, not just the father of the nation of Israel, but the father of all nations. And there are various promises that are made to Abraham in the narrative of Genesis, which in Jewish tradition are very important and shape the theology and indeed the politics of modern Israel as well as modern Judaism. So one promise was the land. God promised Abraham that he would have land and he would have then descendants, and those descendants would be living in that land. And you can see how that shapes modern Israeli politics in terms of saying the promise that this was our land goes not back just to Moses and the Exodus, but it goes right back to the beginning, to Abraham, to the father of our nation. The other thing about Abraham is that God says to him that he will be a blessing for all the nations. And I mentioned those genealogical charts earlier on, or genealogical tables that list all of the nations, and that's even before Abraham. So Abraham is considered in Jewish theology, in Jewish understanding, to be the father of all the nations. And indeed, not only Jews, but also Christians and Muslims, the three religions of the book, look back to Abraham as the kind of founding father of their religion. So they're the promises to Abraham: the promise of land, the promise of descendants, promise that he will be a blessing to all the nations. There are various moments in the story when a covenant is made or remade or re-emphasized with Abraham. And we have this chart here just to indicate the importance of Abraham in terms of sources that we've been looking at. We can get a sense of that when we look at the name of God in those various covenant stories. God is the Lord, the tetragrammaton, I think, in Genesis 12. God is the Lord God in Genesis 15. He's the Lord El Shaddai in Genesis 17. and he is Elohim, God, in Genesis 22. So that might say something about the sources of the various covenant stories. And we could go off on that track, but we're not going to explore source criticism as much in this session. But you should be aware of that from what we have talked about with sources earlier. The significance of the name by which God is called might indicate a different kind of origin in time and place. So these are stories that have been compiled together over time about Abraham, and various streams had various stories or narratives about his significance. Now, Abraham, of course, is the father of faith, but he has quite a dysfunctional family. On several occasions, he lied that Sarah was his sister. Whilst he listens to his wife, he also has a child through Hagar, Sarah's handmaiden, because he thought that Sarah and he thought that they weren't going to have children because of their age. So he reproduces through Hagar, and then Sarah does provide a child. So a dysfunctional family. But we want to think about Abraham and Sarah and an interesting story that we pick up about Sarah in these ancestral narratives.
So we're going to ask you to think about Sarah and look at this passage in your small groups in the breakout rooms. I mean, what does it tell you about Sarah? What does it tell you maybe about how her relationships are, and how does she interact with others and maybe with God?
So that passage is listed on the top of page 55.
Yep, you can find it there. So I'm going to pop you all into breakout groups. How did you go with this passage from Genesis? What did you learn about Sarah?
She's obviously very important to God.
She's very important.
Yeah, because Abraham was really kind of pushing the Ishmael thing, and he's like, no.
The other one we commented on is the fact that God changed her name. And I'm wondering what the significance of that was.
Not much.
Not much.
Sarai is really a diminutive form of Sarah. So it's kind of like the ancient equivalent of Sally, which was a diminutive form of Sarah. And I guess what the main change it may signify is that and it means little princess or something like that. And she's not a little princess anymore. By adopting her full name, Sarah, she is a mature woman ready to, I guess, be the mother of nations. Right. That's my guess. Okay. It's like Lizzie to Elizabeth. It's that sense. Where Abraham's is much more significant, his name change, because he changes. Abraham means father of nations. So his name is changed to actually reflect what the covenant and the prophecy is from God. Anything else you picked out of this?
We have a question. Oh, Kayleen, did you want to raise the question about the family tree?
We were looking at the family tree, and the way it's drawn, it looks as though Sarah is his sister. You know, the way that's drawn.
Yes.
So you have Terah, and then you have Abraham, Sarah, and what is it, Nahor and Haran. So, yeah, that's what it looks like.
Yes, that's an interesting observation. And there is some scholarly discussion about this, and certainly the rabbis talk about it, whether Sarah was actually Abraham's actual sister. So when he says she's my sister, he's telling the truth, but she's also his wife.
Oh, okay.
And of course, brothers and sisters marrying was common in areas like Egypt. Well, it was certainly common among the pharaohs.
Yes.
How common and how widespread this was in the ancient Near East generally at this very, very ancient time, I'm not sure we can be certain about that. But yes, there is some discussion that she actually was his sister, but there's others who say she wasn't. Because she's...
I thought she was a half sister because he had a common father but different mothers.
That's quite possible.
Yes.
But there's a lot of theories around this. This is what I'm saying. I don't think there's a knockdown right answer here. because you can demonstrate different theories using different ways of looking at and reading the text where this table is constructed from.
Okay.
And,
Yeah.
and we had a question about Hagar as well. You know, Hagar is the mother of nations as well, because Ishmael was, he made a covenant with Ishmael, and why was Hagar just left out?
So what's your question about this, Henrietta, or are you just making a comment?
No, we were asking why Sarah, because Hagar is also the mother of Ishmael, who was the father of all nations. I mean, he's made a covenant with Ishmael, but Hagar was just left out. I mean, unlike Sarah. Why was
Hagar's a little bit unusual. For a concubine or a slave woman, she gets a lot of airspace in the narratives, and she actually gets to have a dialogue with God, which is quite unusual. I can't recall Sarah having a chat with God, but Hagar does. So I wouldn't just dismiss her as someone who's sort of kind of secondary to Sarah, because there's things going on with Hagar that aren't going on with Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I mean,
so
Sarah gets the upper hand, but
yeah. So that's the question. Does that reflect the power of Sarah to override to override Hagar?
it only reflects the power of Sarah on the actual mortal plane, if you like. Sarah can kick her out of the tent and send her off and banish her. She's got the power to do that. She doesn't have any power about who Ishmael will be the father of, what nations or anything like that.
No.
So she does have power over Hagar as a slave, but clearly God is saying to Hagar, you know, you're still special and your son is still special. And even though it's a circuitous route that we are going here and it's a bit painful, he is still going to be important and nations will descend from him. Mind you, none of the nations that descend from Ishmael, Israel particularly likes, but that's a moot point, really. Anything else from this passage?
I think that it indicates Abraham's relationship with Sarah in that he ridicules and laughs at the idea of her having a child. And I think that shows a lack of respect for Sarah.
That's an interesting thing you raised there, Pat. Who can think of a parallel passage to this? You should all know the other parallel story. What is it?
About Mary's cousin Elizabeth.
Elizabeth, yeah.
No. Out of the New Testament, there's a parallel story in Genesis in the Old Testament. What is it?
Okay. Don't know.
Okay, let me jog your memory. Sarah and Abraham are in a tent and two visitors front up. What happens in that story?
And Sarah laughs.
What does Sarah do when she hears this prophecy?
When she hears that she's going to have a child.
She
laughs. And what do the two visitors do when she laughs?
Rebuke her, don't they?
They rebuke her. And here is Abraham doing exactly the same thing, because it says Sarah fell on her face and laughed and said, you know, can a man be born? Can Sarah, a child be born to a man 100? Can Sarah, is 90 years old, bear a child? Is God rebuking him? No. Is Sarah rebuked? Yes, she is. And she is rebuked for not showing respect to Abraham, because the implication is he's beyond it. And that's seen as disrespectful. So you've got this parallel passages here, and Abraham is treated quite differently when he does the same thing from what Sarah is treated. And of course, this whole negotiation around Sarah bearing sons, etc., is all done through Abraham. At no point does God actually talk to Sarah. Where he does talk to Hagar, he does have, well, he's got no choice, because there's Hagar out in the desert, and there's only Hagar. So if he's going to talk to somebody who's in charge of Israel, he doesn't have a choice here. It has to be Hagar. Anything else?
If you look at verse 15 of chapter 18, when Sarah laughed, she lied and said, I did not laugh, but he said, yes, you did laugh. So was that God talking to Sarah there?
No, that was the visitors, I think.
Oh, okay.
Talking to her. And she lied about it because she's afraid that she's offended them and done the wrong thing. And they're clearly not quite of this earth. I think they've worked that out by this point. Where Abraham can do it with impunity with God himself and get away with it. Anyway, you might just think about that in my T-shirt when you read these particular narratives.
It's certainly reflecting a very biased point of view towards patriarchy.
Of course it is. That's exactly right. Okay, we better move on now.
Yes,
to
we
our
better
next
move
bit.
on. We've also got a story about Rebecca that we wanted to look at.
So if you'd like to find Genesis 27, 5 to 13.
Genesis, sorry,
27. And this is the story of Rebecca in one part of her relationship with her sons and her husband.
When I was writing the prayer that we were going to use this morning, I said to Elizabeth, what can we say about Rebecca? And she rattled off this long list of adjectives, none of which appeared in the prayer.
And they included words like sneaky and manipulative and self-serving and lots of things.
And I'm surprised though, because, both of them had children and she still had favorites and, and trying to be mean to her elder son.
Yes, so Esau is the favorite of the father, that's Isaac, and he was the firstborn of the two of them. And he's the one that goes and hunts and does things, where the text before this tells us Jacob hangs around the tents. So he hangs around his mother, and he is his mother's favourite as a result. So this is a whole plot to do what?
Take away the birthright.
Yes. I mean, Esau's already been stupid enough to sign over part of his birthright with his bowl of red lentils, with his red stew, because he was unsuccessful. And now that has to be consolidated by the blessing of the father. So whoever Isaac is going to bless is going to be their head and the inheritor. So that's a picture up there. You can see Esau and Jacob, and Esau wants the red stew. And then Jacob, with his mother's conniving, puts hair around his wrists so his hands feel hairy, because Isaac's blind by this stage. So Isaac is tricked into blessing Jacob as the one who will inherit, the head of the family and whatever goes with that.
Elizabeth, did you restart the recording?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yep, it's going. So what are we to make of this?
Dysfunctional family.
It's very dysfunctional. And if you
Just
read this
another
whole paragraph, Rebecca takes the best garments of Esau and she puts them on Jacob, and she puts the skins of the kids on his hand and on his neck so he feels really hairy. And then she hands over savoury food. That is, it's meat, it's not vegetarian. And Jacob takes them into his father and gains the blessing. And he says, and Isaac's not completely stupid, because he says it sounds like Jacob, not Esau's voice, but he's satisfied when he feels the hairy hands and the hairy neck of
and smells the clothes.
Jacob.
Well, the other thing is it makes her quite ruthless.
She's absolutely ruthless. Who knows how they met? Who can, in one sentence, tell me the story of Isaac and Rebecca meeting?
She came out from her father's tent, and he.
Well, she's watering. First off, there's a messenger. A messenger goes, and the messenger has been told by God that the first woman that comes out and offers to water his camels is, or his beasts, is the one for Isaac. And Rebecca fronts up and she waters the camels of the messenger, and the deal is done with him, and then he takes her back. So she never meets Isaac before she marries him. But the fact that the messenger has about 10 camels piled high with gold and silver and jewels and other sort of treasury kind of accoutrements probably plays a large part in the welcome that Rebecca gives the servant, and that Rebecca's father and brothers give the servant, and they're happy to bless this union because obviously it's with a very wealthy man. So the whole thing starts off as quite a mercenary transaction. Okay. Any other questions about our
isn't that-
if we thought Jacob was cunning?
But isn't that partly what women need to do? She doesn't have direct power to say which son inherits. So she's got to use
Her
I
wiles.
guess.
Yeah, but that begs the question: is why does she want Jacob to inherit, and why is she favouring over Esau?
I was actually going to ask the question. So, what's the significance of moving the inheritance from one brother to the other?
Because one was the favourite.
That's right.
It's self-seeking.
It's
Yeah.
But
Sorry.
aren't they looking back and saying this is the line that produces this, king or whatever? So we've got to. Are they justifying in hindsight?
Probably that's part of the story, and it could be a folk tale. There is a pattern in the Old Testament of younger brothers inheriting. Not always, but there is a pattern there that you can see quite obviously in a number of the families, and this one story is no different. And Esau is presented as a bit of a barbarian who just goes out and kills things and grunts at you. And Jacob is presented as someone who's a bit more learned and more intelligent. Certainly he gets his manipulative abilities from his mother, I would suggest.
But it's certainly from the story point of view, a bit like Kate's saying, it's kind of justifying the way they want to live as the people rather than being, hunters and gatherers. They want to be a bit more refined than that.
That's partly probably what the story is too, is we're moving from a hunter-gatherer society into a more settled one. Yeah. And this story may reflect that and have some symbolic meaning to it as well, looking at that.
We all know that it was the rise
about hairy and smooth and
yeah. We all know it was the rise of the public service that brought civilization, don't we?
Absolutely.
That's true.
Kate or Rebecca could have also been looking after her own hide because she knew that Jacob would look after her.
That's exactly right. Yep. In her old age, Jacob was going to be very loyal to her, where Esau was a bit more of an unknown quantity.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so she's a smart woman, but that doesn't make her a good woman. She's quite manipulative.
No. Yeah.
And then we move to Jacob's family, and here you can see that there's 4 women who are mothers of Jacob's children. We have Leah, who's the eldest daughter, that is put onto Jacob without his knowledge and consent. She swapped with Rachel, who he really wants to marry. Then we have Zilpah, who's one of the slaves or concubines. We have Rachel, who is the love of Jacob's life. And then we have Bilhah, who's another slave or concubine. And there's also children born to her.
So this is the full family tree that you have on page 55.
Yeah, that you can look at that.
Descendants.
And you can see that Leah is just as important as Rachel, because Rachel might have been the favourite who had the favourite sons, which are Joseph and Benjamin, and they feature quite significantly in the stories in Egypt of Joseph. But they are not the line through which David and the Messiah descends. You can see that comes down through the line of Judah, who's the eldest. So this is one of the few times in the Old Testament the eldest brother is of significance and the eldest wife is of significance with the Messianic line. Now, Leah wasn't the favoured wife. She does a lot of lamenting that Jacob hates her and he certainly treats her with contempt. And if she wants to spend a night with Jacob, she's got to buy it off her sister Rachel. And they do some transactions around that and Jacob agrees to that. And despite the fact she has all these sons for Jacob, it never really counts for much at all. Rachel's always the favoured one and her children are the favoured children, but it's not her that produces the Messianic line, it's Leah. So Leah is really important in these matriarchal narratives, probably more important than Rachel in a sense.
Well, that's interesting when you realise that, because, as you say, we talk about Rachel far more than we talk about Leah.
Leah, that's right.
Yes.
And I mean, Laban did the wrong thing by Jacob. He makes him work all that time and then he wraps Leah up so she's unrecognisable and says, here's your bride. And Jacob gets a big surprise on the wedding night. It's not Rachel. So, yeah.
Do they have any girls? They have all boys there?
No, there's one girl. There's Dinah.
Okay.
If you look on Leah's youngest child is Dinah.
Oh, Dinah. Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Oh.
So the significance of Jacob, of course, is that he is renamed, and this is the passage in Genesis 35. God appears to Jacob. Remember, you said a week or two ago that in, I think it's the northern source, that God usually appears in dreams, and here's one example. God appeared to Jacob and blessed him and said, your name is Jacob, but no longer shall you be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name.
Because this really...
Yeah. Sorry?
Go on, keep going.
Does it have a meaning? Sorry, does Israel have a meaning and Jacob, like, do those names mean something?
They do.
Israel means
struggles with God.
The Lord is strong or mighty, doesn't it? El at the end is the name of God.
So we're not going into our sources and all the rest of it, because this is so reflective of the time and the place in which these stories were gathered and put together.
Yeah, Jacob means, sorry, Margaret, yes, that's right, we're not doing that. Jacob means the one who struggles, the one striving with God. And Israel means God rules, or God is strong. Yeah.
And that, of course, becomes the name the nation's known by eventually, the name Israel.
And then Genesis 35 lists the 12 sons of Jacob, and they are important because those names, with the exception of Joseph, those names provide the names for the various tribes. Joseph's group split into Manasseh and Ephraim. And the map on the right-hand side is a kind of a reconstruction of what we have later on in the Deuteronomistic history about the territories that were given. And Numbers sets out very clearly which tribe is given which territory. And of course, it's being written a long time after the historical events, if there were historical events, and gives this kind of schematic analysis. And so that's how, in Jewish tradition, that's how the 12 sons become important as leaders of the 12 tribes, and the tribes each have a place to rest, except for one.
Dinah.
Joseph. No, Dinah doesn't get, no, Dinah, we're talking about the blokes, Kayleen.
No, I want to focus on poor Dinah. She's just disappeared. Yes.
Oh, yes. Yes, that's right.
The Levites.
So
Levi.
The Levites.
Yes. Oh, there he is, yes.
Yeah, Levi, the tribe of Levi is not given land because the Levites become the temple servants. And whilst they live in certain cities that are set apart for them, but they don't have a block of land, an area of land. So Joseph is divided into Manasseh and Ephraim, and that makes up the 12. Yeah. I think we might. Do we want to look at Rachel, Elizabeth, or we probably?
We've just talked about Rachel. I think with Leah and Rachel being the favoured wife, she's also barren like Sarah. And her children come quite late in life, and with her second child, she dies in childbirth. And that's why Benjamin and Joseph are the favoured sons of Jacob, which leads into the whole jealousy of the brothers and the narratives of Joseph in Egypt. So she's quite significant as the mother, I guess, of Joseph and those narratives. But as I said, it's Leah that is the one who establishes the messianic line through Judah. So that's probably all we need to say about that, except women seem to have a lot of jealousy with each other in these poly kind of wife households.
Well, it's probably fighting for survival.
That's right.
Sounds a bit like maths.
He's a bit, yes, probably. As I said, the story of Joseph is quite significant because, again, it's the dreaming kind of stories where Joseph is a prophet who interprets these dreams. Probably not the most sensible prophet to tell his brothers they'll all be bowing down to him. They don't take that well, and they don't take it well. He's a favourite, but it leads to this whole narrative of the rise of Israel in Egypt and gives you a background story how they became slaves there. So the story of Joseph is quite important for different reasons from Abraham and from the Messianic line. Now, I've got a question for you because I want to emphasise how important the matriarchs and the women are in these narratives. And this is a question that no one from Tuggeranong who's done the Bible study and knows the answer, you're all forbidden to answer because you know it. I'm going to ask the people who haven't done that Bible study, how many women did it take to enable Moses to do what he did? How many? Think about it.
There's his mother.
Yes.
And his grandmother.
His sister.
His sister. I don't know about his grandmother.
Okay,
his mother
sister.
and his sister.
The Pharaoh's daughter.
Pharaoh's daughter.
The midwives.
The midwives.
Mm-hmm.
There's one more.
His wife?
His wife. So how many is that?
I think that's 5, isn't it?
It's
5 or 6.
Okay, we have 2 midwives, 1 mother, 1 daughter, 1 sister, 1 Pharaoh's daughter, 1 wife, and then his sister Miriam. 8.
8.
No,
Well,
you
his sister Miriam is the go-between.
7.
It's 7 actually.
7. You've counted Pharaoh's daughter twice.
I've counted. No, yeah, I've counted his sister twice. So there's 7 women are necessary to save this man's life. First, the midwives don't kill him, according to Pharaoh's decree. Secondly, his mother hides him with the help of her daughter, his sister, and he's found by Pharaoh's daughter, who rescues and adopts him. And then we have this very curious story about his wife Zipporah. He's about to be killed by God, and his wife, realising the wrath of God's about to fall of him, really quickly circumcises their son and tips Moses with the blood of the circumcision, and that saves his life. So if these women had not been doing countercultural things, and they're not doing what they're told, and Moses is not doing what he's told in one thing, and actually intervene to keep him alive, Moses would never have happened. So think about that. If you ever think men are more important in the Old Testament, the women are just as important, because without them, this would never have happened.
And the other interesting aspect of that, Elizabeth, is we don't have to read between the lines to get these 7 women. They're all named. They're all clearly part of the story.
They are.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, I don't think we know his mother's name, but certainly she's important. And we don't know Pharaoh's daughter's name, though the rabbis do name her.
Yeah, but they're there. They're not sort of hidden, and we don't have to surmise that they're there.
No, we don't. And his wife Zipporah and his sister Miriam are clearly named, and the midwives are clearly named, which is unusual, and which the text is highlighting how important they were by giving them a name in this chain of events that plays out in Egypt, and then with, you know, the whole Exodus story. So next time you think about the blokes who are important, think about the women behind them, and there's probably a few, and they probably wouldn't have got over the starting line had it not been for these women.
Take the women out of the story, you haven't got a story.
No, you don't. That's exactly right. So where it is a patriarchal narrative, we do know women are important. It's all right, John, you can move it on.
Yep. So we're going to move on to pages 57 and following. We've been thinking about the people in the story and characteristics of the people and relationships of the people. But the other key thing to pick up from these stories, which is woven right throughout, is the covenant. So if you look on page 57, I want to move into this by thinking about how do we describe human relationships. So what do the following phrases mean to you? When somebody says they are an item, what's that saying about?
They're going out together.
People are going out together, yeah.
Special friends.
It doesn't mean they're
What
a
about-
piece of merchandise.
No. What about it's a bargain? What is that? What does it's a bargain convey about human relationship?
Cheap.
Cheap.
Good value.
Good value.
Good value. Who's talking to whom with it's a bargain?
You're talking to someone you've been negotiating with, and
Right,
you're saying, "I agree to your terms."
Business
All right,
transaction.
it's a bargain. Let's shake on it. Yeah. Another connotation of that could be, I want to sell you something and you're not quite sure, and I'm saying to you, "Come on, it's a bargain." You're that.
Well, yeah.
You've got a deal. Is what Patricia was just saying. I guess you've got a deal. Let's shake on it. Yeah.
Yeah.
We shook hands. So we've got language about agreement. What about signed, sealed, and delivered? What does that convey in terms of the kind of relationship that's happening?
Agreed and acted upon. So whereas the others you've made a verbal agreement, signed, sealed, and delivered means you've put it in writing and you've met the obligation.
Legally binding.
Yeah.
Yeah, legally binding. Yeah. So it gives an intensified, more formal quality about the relationship. We signed the treaty. Words of the Australian Prime Minister in 2025.
An agreement that's been worked out.
It's in writing. It's I suppose a legal document by then.
And,
I think sometimes it's out of necessity that they've signed the treaty because of pressure from the other side.
Yep.
So it involves a couple of people, other parties, and it's been negotiated.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's quite a process involved.
Yeah. So I think Piers' point is you can have a superior power with a treaty that might enforce certain conditions, like happened after World War I, for instance, and that worked so well.
With Japan particularly.
At the bottom,
we see it later on in the Old Testament when people like the Assyrians put pressure on the southern kingdom to pay money to the Assyrians, but on the condition the Assyrians didn't invade them.
Yep, exactly.
And deport them too, like they did the Northern Kingdom.
So treaty and contract and even covenant are not necessarily between equal partners.
No.
We thought that we'd just have a quick look at these passages. Can we do this in small groups?
Yeah, we can. They're at the bottom of page 57 there. And there's two questions there. It's about Israel's relationship with Yahweh, and it's looking at those four passages. And there's four groups, so I might assign one passage per group. So if group one, and I'll tell you who they are, group one has got Enid and Henrietta in it. Can you look at Exodus 6, 2-8? Group two's got Kate and Kayleen and Margaret in it. You can look at Leviticus 20. Group three has Dorothea in it and John in it, and you can look at Deuteronomy 4. And group four has Mary and Patricia and Pat in it, and you can look at 2 Samuel 7 and read those passages and then think of the questions. What do the above passages reveal about the relationship Israel has with God, and what words are used to describe it? What did you find by your explorations? Group one, you had Exodus 6. What did you discover in Exodus 6?
That God reaffirms the covenant that he had with Jacob, Abraham.
With Abraham.
And that this continues with their offspring, which are now the Hebrew people in Egypt. And he will support them and support them exclusively against other people, other tribes.
Yes. I will take you as my people and I will be your God.
Yeah. So it's the word to describe the quality of the relationship, I would say, was a covenant.
Yes, because it's reminding them of the covenant that was with Abraham, is it not? And all the conditions of that covenant.
Yes.
And this passage includes a very important theological word. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. God saying that, and redemption, of course, becomes key in the Jewish storytelling, and then, of course, in Christian theology, how we understand the cross, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other comments about Exodus? Okay, group 2, you had Leviticus. What did you find in Leviticus in terms of quality of relationship and the relationship of Israel with God?
Well, they were special and they were holy and they were set apart and they were going to inherit a lot. I mean, they really got the lot. But they had to behave themselves.
Well, they weren't allowed to take on the beliefs or practices of the land they were going through. They needed to separate themselves from other peoples and stick with Yahweh.
This is known as the Holiness Code because Leviticus emphasises this, that you're a nation set apart, which is what holiness means, to be set apart. So you're distinct, you have distinct practices that differentiate you from the other people in the land, and we don't like what they do anyway, they're abominations. And if you do this sort of thing again, you will be my holy set apart people.
Yeah. We were intrigued with one word, though, and that was the land to which I bring you to settle in may not vomit you out.
Yes.
Right.
So if you defile it, it will basically throw you up.
Okay.
Very descriptive, isn't it?
And we need to bear in mind here that this is a story set in the time of Moses. The people who are telling this, who are writing it down, are the priests in the context of return from exile. So they're telling the story as if Moses was told at the beginning, if you go into the land and you're disobedient, the land will vomit you.
Yes, of course.
The purpose really is for the returning exiles from Babylon to know when they go back to the land, they have to be holy, pure, obedient, all of that stuff, or the land will vomit them out.
That's right. And you don't take your bad Babylonian habits with you, thank you very much. Whatever they might be. You've got to live by this purity, set apart holiness code.
I also, it's uncomfortable reading in terms of First Nations perspective.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, it is. And and when we look at this, you know, it's basically you have a God that's in Joshua saying, go commit genocide, and he gets pretty cranky when they fail to do that. And that's a really difficult thing to come to terms with, and how we interpret that and grapple with that. Because it is basically saying, my chosen people, I'm just going to kill off everyone else and give them this land that they have no claim or entitlement to whatsoever other than my say-so. And that's a sobering thing when we put it in those terms, but that is in fact what bits of Joshua says. Other bits of Joshua suggest that they were already in the land and that they intermarried and intermingled, and their takeover, in inverted commas, of the land was more a gradual kind of infiltration and coming to positions of prominence among those people, which is probably historically more accurate than some amazing conquest where walls fell down and the sun stood still. So scholars think that they were probably of Canaanite origin themselves, but they rose to prominence as the most dominant tribe, and by infiltration and other ways, political means, they took over the land and became the dominant ethnic group in it. Anyway, that's another book for another time. So let's move on to Deuteronomy 4, and that was group 3 had that. What did you think about what Deuteronomy 4 had to say?
Well, it's a summary of the covenant of the 10 Commandments. And it's a call to live what the covenant says and remember how it was given to us, but also children and everybody else. Assemble everybody and pass it on to them as well.
Yeah. And the last line says, again, reinforces the idea that the Lord, you are the people of his very own possession. So you're special. The Lord has chosen you. We get that in, again, repeated in Deuteronomy.
Not to make any idols.
Not to make any idols, yes. That's really emphasised in this part of Deuteronomy. And of course, in the prophets, we find that making idols and bowing down to other gods and things becomes a real problem that the prophets get quite worked up about. So here we have here in Deuteronomy, really spelling out that that is one thing you just don't do. If you are the chosen people of God, you don't start making likenesses of anything or bowing down to it, or you don't look at the heavens and think, oh, mighty sun, and bow down to it. So it's very clear cut here.
So I guess, again, in the context of when this was written, that was an issue. If they're being influenced by Babylonian religions and so on, and you know, we had the Baals and all the things from that time of exile, this becomes really, really important because the God of the people is an invisible God.
Yes, and you're right, Margaret, it does become really important. And you can see that Baal, if you look up at the first few verses in chapter 4, you can see that Baal is mentioned there. Baal was kind of the Canaanite version of Yahweh. They had a lot of very similar characteristics as gods. And it's clear from reading our text that stamping out Baal worship was really, really difficult.
Yes.
And because Baal worship is so widespread and it's hard to stamp out, that's one of the reasons that scholars think that the Israelite people were just another ethnic group within Canaan already, because so many of them were worshipping Baal.
Okay.
And stamping that out become a real issue, even if you have spectacular stories like Elijah setting fire to 12 bulls on 12 altars that he's drenched with water, and the priests of Baal all being slaughtered at that time. So it's a real issue. This syncretism is obviously a big deal in Israel, and it's being addressed in this passage. Okay, the next one was 2 Samuel.
Yep.
That was group 4. So what did you think of 2 Samuel?
Well, he's doing a lot of praising.
He is doing a lot of praising.
And adoration and yes.
And you might notice in verse 23, there's that word again, goel, redeem.
Yes.
You have redeemed it as a people. You've made a great name for yourself, doing great and awesome things for them. So, you know, we are your people. Yep. And you are great because you made us great.
It's a commitment, isn't it? It's a commitment because they feel God is so great.
Yes.
They think God is so great because he's given them so much. There's an arrogance, I think, that comes through the way it's written. For this reason, thou art great, O Lord.
Yeah.
And it's because of what he's given them rather than
who he is.
Yeah.
So what does David want to do? Because it's David speaking. What does he want to do as a result of all this greatness of the Lord?
He wants to establish himself in God's sight.
He wants to do something else. Have a look in verse 27.
He wants to build temple for God.
He wants to build a temple, yeah. And if you keep reading this, you'll find that God says, I've got 2 words for you, David, in your temple.
No.
No and no. That's right. Not going to happen, dude. But David's doing what I consider quite an obsequious prayer here, praising God with the aim of building this temple.
Something for himself.
Well, it is partly for himself, but it's also partly so there's this static thing. So God's no longer wandering around with the people. It becomes a static, established place where the God of Israel is going to be. So he's not in a tent anymore. He's going to be in a house that's presumably made of stone or something much more substantial than animal hide.
And there is a sense that the power then becomes focused in a place much more substantial. A lot harder to knock down a temple than
than a tent.
Yes. And it is. It's focusing the seat of the Lord, if you like, in a place, in a solid building.
And it's based on something that becomes something that is quite important in the Jewish retelling of the story. It's what God has done. It's the acts of God, the mighty acts of God, that has enabled us to be in this land. You drove out the people, and you brought up the land, and you drove out their gods as well. And so building the house, building the temple, is a natural kind of response to ensuring the solid, all-encompassing dominance of the land in response to what God has done. So it's obsequious, but it's also strategic planning for the future, in David's mind. And house, of course, has that dual sense. We're talking about the house of David. Jesus is of the house of David, meaning family line. So house of is both the continuation of the family, the line that's assured, but also the building of the temple.
Yeah.
Look, we should move on and just have a look briefly at a few things from page 58. Having looked at the quality of the relationship with God, thinking about the people the parties to the covenant. So in Genesis 9, we have Noah and his sons saying, God saying, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you. So it's an ongoing covenant. Verse 10, and with every living creature that is with you. So this is a global, this is universal, a cosmic covenant. And the sign of that covenant is, of course, the bow that is set in the clouds. This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh. So it's significant that this is the earliest covenant and this is the most universal covenant. This is right back in the prehistory, the primeval history section of Genesis.
And it goes forever.
Yeah. The covenant with Moses on the mountain. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings. Now, if you obey my voice, keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples, a priestly nation, a priestly kingdom, a holy nation. So a lot of key words in this compressed story here. God has the whole earth, but God has chosen out of all of that, out of the universal covenant with Noah, God has chosen through Moses this people to rescue, to redeem, to establish as holy. And then, of course, in 2 Samuel, the Lord of hosts is God over Israel, and the house of your servant David will be established before you. In section D on that page, there's a question about the length of time that the covenant relationship is intended to last. I'll just short circuit this by saying to you, in Genesis 9, the covenant is everlasting. In Leviticus 24, the covenant is to go forever. In Isaiah 55, the prophet declares that God's covenant is everlasting. And Ezekiel bangs those two terms together. Ezekiel 37, the covenant is an everlasting covenant forevermore. So
just in case you missed the point.
A clear theme right throughout all kinds of strands, wherever they come from source-wise, all kinds of strands, emphasizing that the covenant is forever. Now that raises a significant question for us as Christians, because if we say we are inheritance, we have inherited the stories, the people, the promises, the covenant of Israel, then we are continuing that covenant on. And what's embedded in that is a question about, well, what about the covenant with Israel and with the Jewish people? And that's the issue that Paul is grappling with in Romans 9 to 11 about God's covenant was forever. Has God gone back on his word? No, God has not gone back on his word. He continues the covenant with Israel. So that's a significant theological claim then. We wanted to look. We still have time to do this, do we?
Oh, you've got 3 minutes.
although the covenant is promised to be eternal, what happens to break the covenant? We're going to do this in small groups.
We can pop you into small groups for 5 minutes if you're happy to do that. And group 1 can do Deuteronomy, group 2 can do Judges, group 3 can do Psalm 78, and group 4 can do Jeremiah. And they're at the bottom of page 58 in your book. And I will quickly open your rooms right now.
So we've decided that we won't have a report back from each group, but I'll suggest to you what you've been talking about. You've been talking about the people being disobedient, breaking the laws, worshipping Baal, setting up new altars, setting up lots of altars, worshipping lots of gods. Did I mention Baal? Being stubborn, having an evil will. Did I mention Baal?
Don't forget Baal.
Anybody got anything else to add to that?
No.
Okay.
That's what it was all about.
That's right.
So out of that situation of continued and widespread disobedience emerges the famous saying in Jeremiah, the vision of the new covenant. God says to Jeremiah, the days are surely coming when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant I made that they broke, but this covenant will be, I will put my law within them. I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God and they shall be my people. That's language from the old covenant, which is continued.
Yes.
But this is a different quality of covenant. They shall no longer teach each other or say, know the Lord. They will already know me. It will be inside them. I will forgive their iniquity and remember their sins no more. So the new covenant passage in Jeremiah, of course, is significant not just for Israel and the return from exile and the re-establishment of, after the time of Jeremiah, the re-establishment of Israel, the land of Israel, the city of Jerusalem, the temple. It's not only significant there, but it becomes significant because this passage is quoted and used in the New Testament to refer to what God is doing in Jesus, that this is the new covenant. Or another way in Greek to translate the word diatheke, which is rightly translated covenant, is that this is the New Testament. So in fact, the name of our collection of Christian scriptures, the New Testament, could also be the New Covenant and draws directly on this idea here. So Jeremiah, in the midst of the threats and the destruction and the sending to exile, has this vision of a renewal in a new way, putting it inside the people, and that is picked up in Christian storytelling and in Christian theology, a really important passage. So what we want to, sorry about the very quick ending then for this session, there's more material there that you can look at after the session. So we want you to think about what the passages that we've looked at, and they've drawn from more than the ancestral narratives, what they indicate about how the covenant is kept and broken and renewed. And there's a quote there from Kathleen O'Connor about the new covenant and Christianity. We'll leave that for you to ponder. And you might like to think, in going away from here, how would I, or how will I, or how have I preached from the ancestral narratives? What does the story say about the journey of faith, your own faith journey, the questions that arise? What are the directions you might take? Ancestral stories and stories about the covenant, how it was passed on. How will that work into congregations in the 21st century? That's the big hermeneutical question, the big interpretation question that flows on from today. We've got something really easy next week in comparison to the complexity of today. We'll be looking at the Exodus.
Right.
I'm not sure we're going to find it easy. I think that's a bit of a furphy myself.
I think so too.
Nothing's easy in this. It's all so interesting. It's great.
Yeah, nothing is easy in this because it's old and it's complicated. So it's Exodus next week. You feel free to read ahead as well as do the homework Joan has suggested in coming to grips with patriarchs and covenants. And thank you all for coming this morning, and we'll see you all next week.